We are at the opening screen for LSAT PrepTest 157 over at lawhub.lsac.org. And we're going to begin the first section, which is the reading comprehension section. We're going to go to the questions. As always, we start with our upfront passage read. So we're going to go ahead and click passage only view, not even caring what the first question is. We're going to select one of our highlight colors, and we're going to engage in our upfront read of this first passage. So the goal here is to read a paragraph, stop after reading the full paragraph, and then contemplate which single sentence best captures the author's main idea and, to a degree, main conclusion of that paragraph. Then, if you decide you need an extra sentence to provide proper context, you can do so, but you want to highlight a maximum of 2 sentences for any paragraph just about. So we'll begin reading at the top. The late 1950s and early 1960s were a time of profound growth for the civil rights movement in the United States. Although racial segregation in the public schools had been outlawed in 1954, the ruling applied only to this one category of discriminatory practice in U.S. society. But it furthered within the African American community the anticipation of broader changes. It was in this climate that the student sit in demonstrations of the early 1960s were born. The technique of the sit in was simple: African Americans occupying whites only seats in racially segregated establishments. But this new type of student activism galvanized established civil rights organizations, brought about the creation of new ones, and generated support for the civil rights movement among many new segments of the populace. So, we should, I hope, determine that the main point is this final sentence. Everything to that point is really going to be a bit of background information. And if you want a little bit more background information, you can choose to highlight one of these sentences. But I would argue that it's probably best to only highlight the final sentence, because all of the other sentences prior to that yellow highlighted sentence really function as equitable background. And if you highlight one sentence over another, you might overemphasize that piece of information over everything else. And when you're dealing with the highlighting, part of the goal is to make sure that you're highlighting only the big picture stuff so that you aren't implicitly overemphasizing any specific details for later questions. So now that we've got this final sentence of the opening paragraph highlighted, we will do the same, read the second paragraph in full, and then consider which sentence best captures the author's main idea of that second paragraph. Initiated by 4 students of the North Carolina Agricultural and Technical College, the first sit-in occurred at a lunch counter in February 1960. Sit-ins then spread rapidly through the southern United States, involving over 70,000 participants by August 1961. The sit-ins provided an important model for nonviolent protest and showed students that they could affect the political process. The influence of these demonstrations on the determination of the student activists was particularly visible in 2 events: the formation of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the birth of a second form of sit-ins called Freedom Rods. So I would once again state that the final sentence best captures the author's main idea about the building of the sit-in movement. Now, you may decide that you'd like to add a little bit more context, and I would probably say we'd want to highlight this sentence right before, just again to connect the narrative from the prior paragraph to this paragraph. The details about who started the sit-ins is going to be just a detail, so we don't want to highlight that information that starts. Those are statistics that if we need them later, we can come back and get them. But I would state that we probably have the overall narrative at this point through the 2 first paragraphs. Continuing on, the formation of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee followed the first sit-in by just a few months and not only solidified student involvement in the civil rights movement, but also placed students in leadership roles for the first time. It operated independently of other civil rights organizations and relied on strong local leadership, helping to transform student involvement from participation in small-scale protests into a sustained effort to challenge discrimination throughout the United States. But the development that marked the clearest turning point for the civil rights movement was the freedom rides. Okay, that seems like a big opinion. We probably want to note that mentally. The goal of the rides, which were organized in 1961 by the already well established Congress of Racial Equality, was to challenge segregation through the occupation of whites only seats on interstate buses and in facilities at the various terminals at which the buses stop. Because the rides inspired violent reprisals in some regions, the US government began using force to protect the safety of the Freedom Riders. This was the first government action taken explicitly in support of the cause of desegregation outside the public schools. The Freedom Rides thus helped take the civil rights movement to a new level by underscoring to the United States government and to the US society generally the harsh realities of the segregation system, and by providing for students and their elders alike examples of the methods they might use to achieve a more equal society. So we've already established that the author believes that the development that marked the clearest turning point for the civil rights movement was the freedom rides. And we get the author's position on what the freedom rides accomplished in this final yellow highlighted sentence. So now that we've highlighted these main ideas throughout the full passage, we're going to read through our highlights once just to confirm that we've got a good overall narrative for the passage before engaging with any individual question. So we'll hit previous page and read from the top. The technique of the sit-in was simple. African Americans occupying whites-only seats in racially segregated establishments. But this new type of student activism galvanized established civil rights organizations, brought about the creation of new ones, and generated support for the civil rights movement among many new segments of the populace. The sit-ins provided an important model for nonviolent protest and showed students that they could affect the political process. The influence of these demonstrations on the determination of the student activists was particularly visible in two events: the formation of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the birth of a second form of sit ins called Freedom Rides. But the development that marked the clearest turning point for the civil rights movement was the Freedom Rides. The Freedom Rides thus helped take the civil rights movement to a new level by underscoring to the US government and to US society generally the harsh realities of the segregation system, and by providing for students and their elders alike examples of the methods they might use to achieve a more equal society. So hopefully you can get the author's overall main idea from just these highlighted sentences. There's only ultimately 5 of them, but that's how you're going to focus in on what the big picture stuff is as we now move to questions for this passage.